They say a man's hands tell his story, but Elias's only ever spoke of work and solitude. They knew the heft of an axe and the patience of a needle, but not the weight of another's touch. That is, until her presence became a quiet warmth that seeped into the silence of his life, a warmth he found himself turning toward, as a flower to the sun. The low lamp cast a solitary circle of gold on the pine table, a small island in the vast, listening dark of the house. Elias traced the rim of his empty mug, the ceramic still holding a phantom warmth. Outside, the vast Montana prairie breathed its slow, quiet rhythm under a sliver of moon. This was his life. The clean scent of pine shavings from his workshop, the worn smoothness of the axe handle leaning by the door, the single indentation on his pillow. A life carved from solitude, sturdy and spare. He had built this ranch with his own 2 hands, raised the walls that now held the silence, and found a certain peace in its predictability. The quiet was a companion, the emptiness a known quantity. He expected nothing more. He rose, the scrape of his chair loud in the stillness, and banked the fire for the night. The bed was cold, a space for one, and sleep was a mercy that came swift and deep, a final turning away from a world that had long ago taught him not to ask for more. Tomorrow would be the same. The sun would rise, the chores would wait, and the silence would hold. It was enough. A week later, the silence was broken. A wagon rattled up the long track to his door, a rare and jarring sound that pulled Elias from the focused work of mending a harness. He stood, his hand resting on the familiar weight of the pistol at his hip, his body a study in still readiness. He didn't get visitors. Not like this. The man driving the wagon was stout and red-faced, a land agent from the town of Redemption, a place Elias avoided. Beside him, a woman sat ramrod straight, her face obscured by the shadow of a plain bonnet. She did not look at him. "Thorne," the agent called out, his voice too loud for the peaceful air. "Got that matter we discussed?" Elias said nothing, his gaze shifting to the woman. The matter was a debt owed by a man named Alistair Finch, a man with too much pride and too little sense. Elias had bought Finch's debt to save him from ruin, a quiet act of principle. The payment was to be a season's worth of labor. He had expected a son, a nephew, a hired hand. He had not expected this. "Finch sends his sister Elara to work off his debt," the agent announced, gesturing to the woman with a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Says his sons are needed for his own harvest. She'll cook, clean, mend. Whatever's needed." He made it sound like the delivery of a parcel. Elias's eyes, gray and steady as river stones, finally met hers as she lifted her head. She was not what he pictured. There was a fineness to her features, a proud set to her jaw that defied her slumped posture. But it was her eyes that held him. They were the color of a summer sky just before a storm, and in their depths he saw not defeat, but a fierce, banked resilience. He saw a survivor. "Leave her things," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. It was not a question. The agent, eager to be gone, dumped a small, battered trunk in the dust. Without another word, he turned the wagon and retreated down the track, leaving a cloud of dust and a deeper silence in his wake. Elias and Elara stood in that silence, 2 solitary figures under the vast, indifferent sky. He saw the slight tremble in her hands as she clutched a small, worn satchel. He noted the way she held her ground, not flinching from his steady, assessing gaze. He was a man who understood the language of unspoken things, of survival, of guarded hearts. He saw a mirror of his own solitude in her, but hers was a solitude that had been forced upon her, not chosen. He was the protector, a role he understood. But as he looked at this woman, sent to him like chattel, a new, unfamiliar instinct stirred within him. It was not just about protection. It was about respect. "The house has 2 rooms," he said, his words spare, purposeful. "You'll have yours." He bent, his large frame surprisingly graceful, and lifted her trunk as if it weighed nothing. He did not ask for thanks, did not wait for a reply. He simply turned and walked toward the house, the silent invitation clear. You are safe here. He left the door open behind him, a small, deliberate gesture. And for the first time in years, the silence in his house felt different. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. The first days passed in a careful, quiet rhythm, a silent negotiation of space and boundaries. Elara was a ghost in his house, moving with a quiet efficiency that spoke of long practice in making herself small. She spoke only when necessary, her voice soft but clear, asking where to find the lye for the soap or how he preferred his coffee. Elias, in turn, answered with a brevity that matched her own. He found himself watching her, not with suspicion, but with a growing, quiet admiration. He watched her hands, steady and capable, as she kneaded bread, her knuckles slightly raw. He watched the careful way she tended the small vegetable garden she'd insisted on planting, coaxing life from the dry soil. She did not simply work. She nurtured. Their lives began to weave together through the warp and weft of shared domestic tasks. In the evenings, the lamplight no longer illuminated a solitary man, but two people sharing a small circle of warmth. She would sit with her mending, her needle a tiny, flashing star, while he would oil his leather or sharpen his tools. The silence between them was no longer the stark quiet of emptiness, but the companionable hush of shared presence. It was in these moments that trust began to bloom, a fragile thing nurtured by small, unspoken gestures. He started leaving a bucket of fresh, cool water from the well just inside the kitchen door for her each morning, a silent acknowledgement of her labor. She, in turn, began leaving a hot mug of coffee on the corner of his workbench before he headed out to the pastures. No words were exchanged, but the meaning was as clear as a vow. I see you. I value you. One afternoon, a late summer storm rolled in, the sky turning a bruised purple. The wind howled, rattling the window panes, and the rain came down in driving sheets. Elias came in from the barn, drenched and cold, to find Elara standing by the hearth, her expression tight with worry. The fire had dwindled to sullen embers, the woodbox nearly empty. Before he could speak, she turned to him, her hands twisting in her apron. I couldn't get the larger logs to catch, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper, the admission of a lack costing her a visible measure of pride. He saw her shame, her fear of being found wanting. He simply nodded, shrugging out of his wet coat. He went to the wood box, selected a few pieces of dry kindling and a larger log, and knelt before the hearth. She stood behind him, a silent sentinel. He didn't instruct or command. He simply worked, his large, capable hands moving with a practiced economy. He showed her how to arrange the kindling, how to allow the air to draw, how to place the larger log so it would catch from the heat of the smaller flames. He worked without speaking, his actions a gentle lesson. As the fire caught, roaring back to life and pushing the chill from the room, he turned his head to look at her. The damp gets into the wood, he said, his voice low and steady. It's not your failing. It was a simple statement, an offering of reassurance that cost him nothing, but in the quiet space of that storm-lashed cabin, it felt like a profound gift. Elara looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, the guardedness in her eyes softened. A small, hesitant smile touched her lips, a fragile, beautiful thing. Elias, she said, his name spoken softly, not as a summons, but as a recognition. The sound of it in her voice settled something deep within him, a quiet click, like a latch falling into place. He realized, with a jolt that had nothing to do with the cold, that he had been waiting to hear it. The storm raged outside, but within the small, warm circle of the firelight, something new and tender had taken root. The longing, once a distant ache, was now a quiet, steady presence, as constant and as vital as the beat of his own heart. The heat of late summer settled over the prairie, thick and heavy. Days were measured by the slow swing of the sun, the work relentless and grounding. The rhythm of their life together had found its beat, a steady cadence of shared labor and quiet companionship. The trust between Elias and Elara was no longer a fragile seedling, but a deep-rooted certainty, nurtured in the soil of daily acts. He learned the cadence of her breathing as she slept in the room next to his. The thin wall, a porous boundary. She learned the exact moment he would return from the fields, the weary set of his shoulders, a silent language she had come to understand. The longing was a constant hum beneath the surface of their lives, a quiet yearning that manifested in the brush of their hands as they passed a tool, the shared glance across a dinner table, the way they both listened for the other's footstep. One evening, the air was particularly stifling, the heat clinging even after the sun had bled below the horizon. Elara had worked late, preserving the last of the summer vegetables, and her movements were slow with fatigue. Elias sat at the table, mending a bridle, the scent of leather and oil filling the small room. He watched her as she moved about the kitchen, her face pale in the lamplight. He saw the faint tremor of exhaustion in her hands as she washed the last of the dishes. He set his work aside, the decision made in the space of a single heartbeat. He rose and went to her. She turned, startled, as he took the dishcloth from her unresisting fingers. "Go and sit," he said. It was not a command, but an invitation. "I'll finish this." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise and something deeper, something vulnerable, in their depths. No one had ever offered her such a simple, unadorned kindness. She hesitated, a lifetime of self-reliance making it difficult to accept care. He did not press, simply stood, his presence a quiet, unwavering offer. Finally, with a small, almost imperceptible nod, she moved to the chair he had vacated, sinking into it with a sigh of weariness. He worked with a quiet competence, his large hands gentle with the fragile crockery. The simple domestic act felt more intimate than any touch they had yet shared. He was taking care of her, a vow spoken in the clink of a plate and the splash of water. When he was done, he dried his hands and turned to her. She was watching him, her gaze soft and unguarded in the golden light. The air in the room was thick with unspoken things, with the weight of all the lonely years that had led them to this moment. This was the midpoint, the turning of the page. This was a choice. He moved to stand before her, his shadow falling over her. He did not reach for her, did not presume. He waited, allowing her the dignity of choice. "Elara," he said, his voice a low murmur, the sound of her name a caress. She looked up at him, and in that shared glance, the world narrowed to the small, warm space between them. With a deliberation that felt as sacred as a prayer, she raised her hand, not to his face, but to his wrist. She rested her palm against the steady, thrumming pulse she found there, a silent acknowledgment of the life, the strength, the gentleness in him. It was a gesture of profound trust and acceptance. His breath hitched. Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself to one knee before her, bringing them eye to eye. He took her other hand, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. This was their moment of closeness, chosen and deliberate. There was no need for words. In the quiet hush of the lamplight, with the heat of the summer night pressing in around them, they had found their beginning. The arrival of Alistair Finch shattered the quiet harmony of their world. He rode up one blistering afternoon, not on a workhorse, but on a fine-boned Mare, his clothes too clean for a man of the soil. He was handsome in a way that set the teeth on edge, all polished surfaces and easy smiles that never reached his eyes. He was the predator, cloaked in the guise of a concerned brother. He dismounted and strode toward the house as if he owned it, his gaze sweeping over the tidy yard and the blooming garden with a proprietary air. "Sister," he called, his voice booming with false cheer. Come and greet your brother." Elara emerged from the house, her body stiff, her face a pale, strained mask. Elias, who had been repairing a fence post nearby, straightened up, his hand falling instinctively to the warm grip of his pistol. He did not move closer, but his presence was a solid, unyielding statement at the edge of the scene. He would not interfere unless invited, but he would watch. "Alistair," Elara said, her voice flat, devoid of warmth. "What are you doing here?" "Checking on my investment, of course," he said with a charming laugh, though his eyes were cold as they scanned her, lingering in a way that made Elias's jaw tighten. "And to bring you some news. Mr. Henderson, the new banker, has taken quite a shine to you. He's a wealthy man, Elara, a widower. He's asked for an introduction." Alistair's words were a clear threat, a reminder of her precarious position, of his power over her. He was not offering an opportunity. He was announcing a transaction. "I am not for sale," Elara said, her voice low but shaking with a furious pride. Alistair's smile tightened. "Don't be a fool. This is your chance. A life of ease instead of this rustic squalor." He gestured dismissively at the small, sturdy house Elias had built with his own hands, at the life she and Elias were quietly building within it. He stepped closer to her, lowering his voice to a coercive murmur. "You will be pleasant to him, Elara. You owe me that. You owe the family." It was then that Elias moved. He did not stride, did not rush. He simply closed the distance with a deliberate, silent purpose that was far more intimidating than any overt aggression. He stopped a few feet away, positioning himself slightly between Alistair and Elara, a living shield. He did not look at Alistair. His eyes were on Elara. "Is this man bothering you?" he asked, his voice calm, level. He was giving the choice, the power, to her. Her answer would determine his next action. The question hung in the hot, still air. Elara looked from her brother's entitled, handsome face to Elias's plain, stoic one. She saw the coercive demand in Alistair's eyes and the quiet, unwavering respect in Elias's. It was no choice at all. She took a small step, a slight shift of weight that aligned her with Elias, a silent declaration of allegiance. "He is trespassing," she said, her voice clear and strong. Elias's gaze shifted to Alistair. The quiet rancher was gone, replaced by the protector, his eyes as hard and unyielding as granite. "You heard the lady," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous softness. "Get off my land," Alistair sputtered, his polished veneer cracking. "She is my sister. Her debt is to me," Elias cut in, his voice sharp as a razor's edge. "And the terms of its payment are my concern, not yours. Now leave." Faced with Elias's implacable will, Alistair's bluster collapsed. He saw something in the rancher's eyes that his own brand of bullying could not overcome. With a final venomous glare at his sister, he mounted his horse and galloped away, leaving a trail of impotent dust. The social pressure had come, had tested their bond, and had found it unbreakable. Elias did not move until Alistair was a speck on the horizon. Only then did he turn to Elara. The hardness in his eyes melted away, replaced by a quiet, profound concern. He did not touch her, but his gaze was a question, an offering of comfort. The bond, forged in the heat of domesticity, had been tempered into steel. The dust from Alistair's departure settled, but a tense silence remained, thick with the unspoken and the newly revealed. Elara stood frozen, her arms wrapped around herself as if to hold in the tremors that threatened to shake her apart. The confrontation had stripped away the last of her carefully constructed defenses, leaving her raw and vulnerable. Elias watched her, his heart aching with a protective instinct so fierce it was a physical pain. He saw not a victim, but a warrior who had just fought a terrible battle. He moved toward her slowly, giving her time to retreat, to raise her shields again. But she didn't. She remained still, her gaze fixed on the empty horizon where her brother had disappeared. He stopped before her, so close he could feel the faint heat radiating from her skin. The moment stretched, taut and fragile. This was the precipice, the point where everything could change. It was no longer about a debt or a shared roof. It was about a shared life. "He will not come back," Elias said, his voice a low, certain vow. It was a promise of protection, a shield forged of his own will. Elara finally looked at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "He thinks he owns me," she whispered, the words ragged with years of quiet suffering. "He always has. He is wrong." The two words were simple, declarative, and absolute. In his world, a person's worth was not a commodity to be traded. It was an inviolable truth. This was the climax, not of action, but of choice. A choice that had to be made openly, clearly, without coercion or circumstance. Elias knew what he had to do. He held out his hand, palm up, an offering, an invitation. It was the same hand that had held an axe, a pistol, a mending needle. Now it held only a silent, profound question. "Your debt," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "It is paid. You are free to go, Elara. If you wish, I will take you to town myself. I will see you settled safely." He was offering her autonomy, the one thing her brother had always sought to deny her. He was willing to return to his solitude, to the quiet emptiness of his house, if it meant she would have the freedom she deserved. His love for her was not a cage, but a key. She stared at his outstretched hand, at the calloused palm and the strong, gentle fingers. She saw the truth of him in that simple gesture, his strength, his honor, his quiet, unwavering respect for her. She thought of the life Alistair and the banker offered, a gilded cage of ease and obligation. Then she looked at the life she had found here, a life of hard work, yes, but also of shared warmth, of silent understanding, of a growing, tender love built on a foundation of mutual respect. She had been sent as the unwanted sister, a burden to be traded away. But in this quiet man's eyes, she had seen her own value reflected back at 100-fold. He was not her rescuer. He was her partner. He had not saved her. He had seen her, and in doing so, had allowed her to save herself. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her own hand. But she did not simply place it in his. In a gesture of ultimate choice, of claiming her own future, she threaded her fingers through his, her hand gripping his with a strength that belied her slender frame. It was an anchor, a promise, a final, irrevocable answer. "This is my home, Elias," she said, her voice no longer trembling, but filled with a quiet, powerful certainty. "If you will have me." A shuttered, guarded part of him broke open at her words. The protector, the stoic, lonely man, felt a wave of profound, humbling gratitude. He had offered her a choice, and she had chosen him. His fingers tightened around hers, his grip warm and firm. "I will have you," he said, his voice thick with the weight of the vow. It was the simplest and most profound truth of his life. In the golden light of the setting sun, they stood together, two solitary souls no longer, their hands clasped, their future chosen, openly and forever. In the aftermath of the confrontation, a new tender quiet settled in the small house. The choice had been made, the vow spoken in plain speech, and now was the time for the gentle settling that follows a storm. Elias led Elara inside, his hand still holding hers, a warm, solid anchor in the swirling currents of emotion. The air in the cabin, once filled with the tension of their unspoken longing, was now soft with a shared, breathable relief. This was the falling action, the quiet moments of aftercare that are more intimate than any grand passion. He guided her to a chair by the hearth, the fire now banked to a gentle, pulsing glow. He knelt before her, his movements as deliberate and reverent as they had been the night he'd first taken her hand. He did not speak, but his eyes, full of a deep, gentle light, said everything. He carefully unlaced her work boots, his large, rough hands surprisingly deft. He chafed her cold feet between his palms, bringing warmth and life back to them. It was a simple, humble act of service, a quiet demonstration of his devotion. "Let me care for you." Elara watched him through a haze of tears she no longer fought to contain. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a profound, overwhelming release. All her life, she had been a survivor, resilient and self-sufficient, because she'd had no other choice. To be cared for, to have her well-being placed so clearly and gently at the forefront of another's mind, was a completely new and deeply moving experience. She reached out, her fingers brushing through his dark, unruly hair. He stilled at her touch, his head bowed, accepting the caress with a quiet reverence. When he was done, he rose and went to the kitchen. She heard the clink of mugs, the splash of water into the kettle. He returned a few moments later with 2 steaming cups of chamomile tea, a small, precious store she had brought with her in her trunk. He had remembered. He set 1 mug into her hands, his fingers brushing hers, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of warmth through her. He sat not in his usual chair across the table, but on the hearthrug near her feet, leaning his back against the warm stone. He was not towering over her, not even sitting as her equal, but placing himself in a position of quiet watchfulness, a guardian at ease. They drank their tea in a silence that was more profound and communicative than any conversation. The shared trauma of Alistair's visit had stripped away all pretense, leaving only the raw, honest truth of their feelings for each other. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, and had not seen weakness, but strength. She had seen his capacity for fierce protection, and had not seen aggression, but a deep, abiding love. When she finished her tea, she set the empty mug on the small table beside her chair. "Elias," she said softly into the quiet. He turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. "Thank you," she said. "It was for everything. For standing up to her brother, for giving her a choice, for kneeling to warm her feet, for the tea, for seeing her, truly seeing her." He simply nodded, his expression serious and tender. "I'll keep you warm," he said. It was another vow in plain speech, a promise not just against the chill of the evening, but against the coldness of the world, against the loneliness that had shadowed both their lives for so long. He reached out and took her hand again, his thumb stroking the back of it, a small, repeated, soothing motion. The touch was not one of passion, but of deep, abiding tenderness. It was the touch of a man who had found his home, not in a house built of pine and stone, but in the presence of the woman before him. The storm had passed, and in its wake, they were left with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a shared shore. The weeks that followed were a quiet unfolding, a gentle blossoming of the love that had been so openly declared. The roles of proprietor and indentured servant had dissolved completely, replaced by the seamless partnership of 2 people building a life. Elias no longer thought of the ranch as his, but as theirs. The house was no longer a place of solitude, but a sanctuary of shared warmth. Their days were still filled with the hard work of the frontier, but now it was a shared burden, lightened by companionship. They moved together in an easy, practiced dance, their actions anticipating each other's needs. A tool passed without a word, a bucket lifted by 2 pairs of hands instead of 1, a shared smile over a row of newly planted winter vegetables. Their intimacy grew not in grand pronouncements, but in the accumulation of 1,000 micro-intimacies. It was in the way Elara would brush a piece of lint from his collar before he rode out, her fingers lingering for a fraction of a second. It was in the way Elias would save her the last, best piece of honeycomb from the hive he kept. He mended the broken clasp on her small trunk, his large hands patient and precise, returning the mended object to her not as a repair, but as a token of his devotion. She, in turn, took the worn-out shirt he used for his dirtiest chores and with thread and careful stitches, patched it until it was whole again, a quiet act of care that spoke volumes. The mended cloth, the repaired clasp, these were their symbols. One evening, as the first autumn chill began to creep into the air, they sat by the fire, the lamp turned low. Elias had been watching Elara as she read from a small, worn book of poetry, her brow furrowed in concentration. The firelight played across her face, softening the proud lines of her jaw and illuminating the quiet strength in her eyes. The yearning he had felt for so long had transformed into a deep, steady current of devotion, a quiet hum of rightness that resonated in his very bones. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crudely carved object. He had spent weeks on it, working in the quiet moments after she had gone to bed, sanding the wood smooth with calloused, patient fingers. He held it out to her. It was a bird, a small prairie sparrow, its wings half furled. It was not perfect, but it was alive with a fierce, humble spirit. Elara looked up from her book, her eyes widening as she saw the gift. She took it from him, her fingers tracing the lines of the carved feathers. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "A home is not a home without a song," he said, his voice a low rumble. It was the most lyrical thing she had ever heard him say. He was giving her not just a piece of carved wood, but a promise. A promise of a home filled not with silence and solitude, but with the quiet music of a shared life. This was their resolution. Not an ending, but a true beginning. It was a future sealed not with a dramatic kiss or a formal proposal, but with a small hand-carved bird and a quiet promise in the firelight. Elara looked from the bird in her hand to the man beside her. The survivor had found her safe harbor. The protector had found his reason. She leaned in and pressed her lips to his. A soft, tender kiss that was both a thank you and a vow of her own. The house was quiet, the fire was warm, and their future stretched before them, a path they would walk together, side by side. The unwanted sister had been sent to the rancher, but she was the one he had chosen, and the one who had chosen him forever.